Few careers in British television history rival the extraordinary run that Jeremy Clarkson has managed to build. His name carries instant recognition, not just for one landmark production, but for an entire string of television moments that fundamentally shaped the medium. Yet for all the success sitting on one side of the scale, the other holds an equally long record of offending, upsetting, and outright enraging people from all corners of the globe. Racist accusations, charges of sexism and homophobia, physical confrontations, and headline-grabbing scandals have followed him like a shadow throughout his career. The sheer fact that any public figure could weather that volume of controversy and remain beloved by millions is, by any reasonable measure, something close to extraordinary. Let's be clear about what we're doing here. This isn't a takedown of Clarkson, nor is it an endorsement. Nobody here is writing the rulebook on British humor or drawing the boundaries of satire. What we are doing is walking through a career unlike any other, one built equally on brilliance and chaos. Where you land on Clarkson by the end of all this is entirely your call. For most people around the world, Jeremy Clarkson is inseparable from one television program, Top Gear. At its commercial and cultural peak, somewhere between 2007 and 2015, the show was pulling in a staggering global audience of 350 million viewers every week across 200 countries. That number alone is difficult to wrap your head around, especially considering the show was fundamentally about cars. Top Gear isn't just one of the most successful factual programs ever broadcast. It's one of those rare achievements with almost no meaningful comparison. To put it in perspective, at its height, Top Gear was arguably outperforming Friends and Seinfeld in combined reach, which says everything about how far beyond its genre the show actually traveled. Strip away the writing, the production, the budget, and the common denominator in all of that success is Clarkson. The original run of Top Gear aired on BBC Two between 1977 and 2001, building a modest following through its coverage of road safety, driving tips, car reviews, and local motoring events. Even before Clarkson came aboard in '88, the show wasn't without its critics. Some felt the presenters were quietly encouraging drivers to take risks. But those early grumbles were nothing compared to what was coming. Before landing on Top Gear, Clarkson had been running a company that supplied car reviews to various publications. His angle was distinctive, a blunt, sardonic voice that pulled no punches and wasted no time with pleasantries. Top Gear took one look at the reviews and immediately signed him up, asking him to bring exactly that energy to television. He did. From the moment he arrived, the show felt different. UK audiences responded immediately to someone who wasn't performing politeness or protecting manufacturer relationships. He said what he actually thought, and more often than not, it was genuinely funny. Almost overnight, Clarkson went from relative obscurity to a household name, and the persona, blunt, rude, borderline insufferable, yet strangely watchable, locked into place. Top Gear's viewership climbed rapidly, and the central draw was always the same. What would Clarkson say next? The further viewer numbers rose, the more Clarkson leaned into provocation, and the relationship between controversy and ratings became something of a self-fulfilling loop. One early example was his review of the Vauxhall Vectra, where he simply called it a box on wheels. A mild enough remark by what would become his standards, but the unapologetic approach was clearly resonating. Before long, the show was regularly clearing 5 million weekly viewers. The BBC, noticing what was happening, attempted to bottle the formula and launch a series of spin-offs: The Cars, The Star, Driven, Pulling Power, The Motor Show, Vroom Vroom, every single one of which quietly failed. The reason wasn't hard to identify. None of them had Clarkson. Top Gear rolled through the 1990s with Clarkson occasionally ruffling automotive feathers, but the general perception was still that his humor was playful rather than genuinely offensive. All salt, no wounds. That perception began shifting in 1998 at the Birmingham Motor Show, where Clarkson reviewed Hyundai vehicles and made remarks implying that South Koreans likely ate dog, and that whoever designed the cars had probably had spaniel for lunch. Hyundai UK responded immediately and forcefully. PR manager Stephen Kitson described the comments as deliberately vindictive, unnecessary, bigoted, and racist. A particularly pointed observation from Hyundai was that Clarkson had not reached for similarly crude stereotypes when reviewing vehicles from France, which suggested to them something more targeted about his attitude toward South Koreans. A formal complaint was lodged with the BBC, which responded not with an apology, but with a statement explaining that Clarkson's remarks had been made entertainingly and with a twinkle in his eye. The complaint was dropped. The BBC would be issuing variations of that same statement for the next 2 decades. Hyundai, for its part, eventually fired back in its own way. Hyundai South Africa produced a remarkably well-crafted Top Gear parody advertisement in 2010 that took a pointed and well-aimed jab at both the show and Clarkson. Whether or not the Hyundai controversy was the reason Clarkson stepped away from Top Gear a year later remains uncertain, though an article he wrote for Top Gear magazine suggests it was at least a contributing factor. In his own words, he said he wanted to explore other opportunities, had grown restless with the show's format, and felt it needed a new direction. He added, perhaps only half-jokingly, that he'd actually fallen asleep at the wheel of a review car and that this was a fairly clear sign things needed to change. Whatever prompted his departure, the consequences were immediate. Viewership collapsed without him, and the show was canceled shortly after. The door was now open for something entirely new. Top Gear was relaunched in 2002 with a completely overhauled format and became a smash from day one. Clarkson worked in close collaboration with executive producer Andy Willman, and together, they stripped the show back to what actually worked, before amplifying everything by an order of magnitude. Straight car reviews, punchy segments with a comedic edge, and boundary-pushing humor threaded through every episode. New elements included the star in a reasonably priced car, a running segment in which celebrities attempted to set the fastest lap around the track, and the enigmatic Stig, an anonymous test driver whose identity became a long-running audience joke. Clarkson returned as host, alongside returning Top Gear veteran James May and newcomer Richard Hammond. What made the trio work was chemistry that went well beyond scripted banter. People who had no interest in cars still tuned in simply to watch 3 people who genuinely seemed to enjoy each other's company. The result was television that functioned on multiple levels simultaneously. At this point, it's worth pausing for a moment before diving into the controversy, because context matters. Top Gear was a scripted show. Head writer Richard Porter was behind many of the jokes that later generated outrage. The widespread assumption that Clarkson alone was the author of everything controversial is a simplification. Clarkson himself has acknowledged in various interviews that he was deeply involved in the writing process, and that he, the writers, and the other presenters often operated by a specific and deliberate principle. If it was going to infuriate BBC management, it was probably going to delight the audience. That was the working philosophy, and it shaped almost everything the show produced during its most watched years. With that framing in place, let's walk through the cultural mockery and stereotyping that became the show's most frequently discussed legacy. The incident started early, as far back as Series 1, Episode 2, when Clarkson remarked that the roads of Wales were ideal for testing cars, since nobody actually wanted to live there. Labour AM Alan Pugh filed a complaint with the BBC, arguing that the comment encouraged irresponsible driving in Wales. The BBC dismissed it without much difficulty. But the complaints that followed over the next several years would be considerably harder to brush off. 2004 brought the first major incident that wasn't about what Clarkson said on television, but what he did in person. At the British Press Awards, he punched Daily Mirror editor Piers Morgan 3 times in the head. Morgan walked away with a permanent scar. Clarkson left with a broken finger. The public was stunned. The backstory was a simmering feud between Clarkson and the Daily Mirror. The paper had published photographs of Clarkson with a woman who wasn't his wife in 2002, photos he had explicitly asked the paper not to run. Morgan published them regardless, and when the opportunity arose, Clarkson responded physically. As something of a footnote worth noting, Morgan had received Newspaper Editor of the Year at that same 2004 British Press Awards ceremony. Just 2 months later, in May of that year, he was fired from the Daily Mirror after authorizing the publication of what he claimed were photographs showing British soldiers abusing Iraqi prisoners. An investigation revealed the photos were fabricated, part of a calculated effort to exploit a genuine prisoner abuse scandal. The paper issued an unreserved apology to the Queen's Lancashire Regiment and terminated Morgan. He maintained he had received the images in good faith. He and Clarkson have since moved past it entirely. Morgan even appeared in a recent season of Clarkson's Farm. Back to Top Gear, and the show was pushing harder with every passing series. Series 7, Episode 1, broadcast in 2005, delivered one of the earlier incidents that showed the show's satirical targets were expanding. During a Tokyo Motor Show segment reviewing the BMW Mini, Hammond described the vehicle as quintessentially British, pointing to an integrated T-set as evidence. Clarkson then followed up by describing what a quintessentially German car might look like: indicators that deployed as Nazi salutes, a sat-nav programmed exclusively for Poland, and a fan belt engineered to endure 1,000 years. That last detail was an unmistakable reference to the Nazi slogan of the 1,000-year Reich. The German government reacted with formal outrage. Viewer complaints reached the BBC Board of Governors in significant numbers. In 2006, the BBC Governors Programme Complaints Committee issued its conclusion, stating that the audience as a whole was unlikely to have interpreted Clarkson's remarks as anything beyond deliberate absurdity, and that the comments would not have encouraged genuinely negative feelings toward Germany or its people. That same year, Clarkson used his column in Top Gear magazine to take a few swings at BBC management, in keeping with the show's practice of deliberately provoking the organization. He suggested the BBC didn't treat Top Gear seriously, ran the episodes too long, and had a habit of replacing the program with snooker coverage, despite Top Gear consistently outperforming everything around it. The BBC's response was characteristically measured. Clarkson's opinions, they said, were an integral part of the program, were not intended as serious commentary, and most viewers understood the tone well enough not to take offense. What came next? In Series 9, Episode 3, the first Top Gear US special in 2007, was a different kind of controversy. The team drove a route from Alabama to Louisiana, and at some point made a deliberate decision to antagonize locals by painting slogans across their cars: "NASCAR sucks," "Hillary for president," and "Man love rules." The provocation worked exactly as intended. A confrontation erupted at a petrol station involving verbal hostility, and, in the chaotic exit, rocks were thrown at the Top Gear vehicles. Clarkson later stated that over the entire history of Top Gear, there were only 2 moments when he genuinely believed someone was going to get seriously hurt. The Alabama petrol station was one. The Argentina incident in 2014 was the other, and we'll get to that. Clarkson also acknowledged that while the confrontation itself was real and genuinely tense, the dramatic escape sequence had been amplified for broadcast purposes. Then came the first of the 3 incidents that tend to define the show's most turbulent chapter, what became known simply as the Tesla episode, Series 12, Episode 7, broadcast in 2008. Clarkson reviewed the Tesla Roadster in his customary fashion and made the claim that the car's battery had given out after just 88.5 kilometers, that a full recharge would require 16 hours, and then showed footage of the car being physically pushed into a garage. Tesla Motors, who had been present during filming, came forward immediately to dispute the account. Their position was that the battery had never fallen below 20%, that a recharge would take only a few hours, and that the only actual technical issue had been a blown fuse. The BBC responded by stating that the scene of the car being pushed was filmed to represent what would have happened had the battery actually depleted, and held that the segment was a fair representation of the vehicle's performance. Tesla CEO Elon Musk pursued a libel lawsuit against the BBC, which was eventually dismissed in October 2011 when Justice Tugendhat ruled that no reasonable Top Gear viewer would have compared a track test to real-world road performance. Series 14, Episode 1 in 2009 took the team to Romania, and this time the fallout wasn't limited to letters and complaints. It included a cyber attack that shook the BBC enough to force real editorial concessions, and internally, the patience of BBC executives was visibly thinning. In the episode, Clarkson referred to Romania as Borat country, populated by gypsies and Russian playboys, a reference to Sacha Baron Cohen's 2006 mockumentary. He also wore what he called a gypsy hat and delivered accompanying commentary that compounded the offense. Romanian ambassador Dr. Ion Ginga responded with notable diplomatic restraint, sending a letter to the production team that acknowledged freedom of expression, broke down the actual ethnic demographics of Romania, and politely requested that the offensive material be removed from the episode. In this case, the request was granted, and edits were made to remove the Borat references and the gypsy-related commentary. Before those edits were completed, a group of Romanian hackers took down 2 pages of the Daily Telegraph, replacing the content with Romanian flags and Zamfir's Lonely Shepherd, with a message declaring they were tired of being misrepresented and publicly humiliated by Top Gear. The cyber attack was a clear signal that things were escalating, a signal Clarkson and the production team appeared to receive and interpret as encouragement. Series 17, Episode 7 brought the India special in 2011, and this time the target was the country's food. A sequence of repeated jokes implied that visiting India would almost certainly result in severe gastrointestinal illness. Clarkson even had a toilet built into the back of his Jaguar as a visual punchline to the premise. The Indian High Commission registered a formal complaint, describing the content as disgraceful, stating that the humor was degrading to Indian society, and expressing clear disapproval of the entire segment. The BBC again fell back on its established response. The humor was not meant seriously and should not be taken as such. We now arrive at what many consider the beginning of the end. 2 controversies that suggested the international community's tolerance for Top Gear's particular brand of humor was reaching its limit. The Mexico incident came first. Series 16, Episode 2 in 2013 featured a review of the Mastretta MXT, a Mexican-designed sports car introduced on the show as the Tortilla. Hammond delivered a description of what a Mexican car would inevitably be like given the national character: lazy, flatulent, heavily mustached, asleep against a fence. Clarkson followed up by suggesting that waking up to realize you were Mexican would be fine, since you could simply go straight back to sleep. The segment then went a step further, with Clarkson essentially goading Mexican ambassador Eduardo Medina Mora by predicting he'd be too lazy to bother complaining. Ambassador Mora promptly did complain, describing the presenters as having resorted to vulgar, inexcusable, and xenophobic insults that reinforced deeply harmful stereotypes. The BBC defended the content as falling within the tradition of national stereotyping in British humor, though it apologized specifically for the remarks directed at the ambassador personally. Ofcom reviewed the episode and cleared it, noting that Top Gear's history of applying this kind of humor uniformly across nationalities was well established and understood by the audience. The same episode had featured considerable mockery directed at Australia and its Top Gear counterparts. That said, wider criticism was mounting. BAFTA award-winning writer Steve Coogan publicly called out the pattern, saying that the apologies were becoming pitiful and that hiding behind the defense of "it's just a laugh" had run its course. Notably, Mastretta General Director Carlos Mastretta took the opposite view entirely, saying the whole thing had simply drawn more attention to the MXT and that he had no complaints whatsoever. With the Mexico episode behind them, what came next was the largest controversy in the show's history, and the clearest sign yet that things were spiraling beyond the BBC's ability to contain them. The Patagonia special saw the team driving from Chile through to Argentina, and unlike previous incidents where some dramatic license was applied after the fact, what unfolded here required no editing or exaggeration. The team genuinely had to flee the country. The catalyst was a license plate. One of the vehicles carried the registration H982FKL, which locals interpreted as a deliberate reference to the Falklands War of 1982, a conflict in which the Argentine military invaded the Falkland Islands, a British overseas territory, only to be repelled at the cost of 900 lives. The defeat contributed to the fall of Argentine President Leopoldo Galtieri. To Argentine veterans and the broader public, the plate was a provocation, and the response reflected that. The hotel housing the crew was stormed by angry protesters. Clarkson later described hiding under a bed, fearing for his safety. He subsequently posted a statement insisting the car had been purchased for the production months in advance and that the plate had been registered to the Porsche since its manufacture in May 1991, that no substitution had been made and no provocation was intended. Local police made clear they were unable to provide protection. The presenters were flown ahead to Buenos Aires, while the crew brought equipment across the border into Chile. The vehicles left behind were later found pelted with rocks. In October 2014, Argentine Ambassador Alicia Castro met with BBC Director of Television Danny Cohen and formally demanded an apology. The BBC refused, broadcasting the episode uncut as a special on 27th and 28th December 2014. A formal investigation launched in May 2015 ultimately concluded that the plate had not been deliberately selected to cause offense. No apology has ever been issued to the Argentine government, and the matter remains unresolved. Even as that investigation was still running, Clarkson had already been suspended, because the incident that finally ended everything had nothing to do with Argentina. It had to do with what happened on a production night in March 2015, and it proved that the BBC did have a line after all. Before we get to the incident itself, one more piece of context. In May 2014, a Top Gear outtake, one that had never been broadcast and was never meant to leave the edit suite, found its way into the public domain courtesy of the Daily Mirror. In the clip, Clarkson could be heard quietly reciting the nursery rhyme, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo," in a way that appeared to include a racial slur. The context suggested he was trying to be funny rather than directing the term at anyone specifically, and whether the word was actually spoken remained genuinely unclear. The BBC commissioned a forensic audio expert to determine what had been said. The result came back inconclusive. Regardless, the organization issued Clarkson a formal final warning: one more offensive incident, anywhere, in any context, and his contract would be terminated. Clarkson responded in his Sun column, writing that even the Archangel Gabriel would struggle to function with a condition like that hanging over his head, and that it was only a matter of time before someone, somewhere, claimed offense, and that would be the end. He maintained he had never used the word, that while certain other profanities were part of his everyday vocabulary with colleagues, that particular one was not. He also expressed irritation at being asked to film an apology video for something he didn't believe he'd done, comparing it to being asked to apologize for starting the war in Syria. He made the video anyway. It bought him several more months. The incident that finally ended everything, what became known as the fracas, happened in 2015. Clarkson reportedly verbally and physically assaulted producer Ocean Timon, following a confrontation that allegedly began when the kitchen at the location had closed for the night, and Clarkson was unable to get a hot meal after a long shoot. Whatever the precise chain of events, the BBC had reached the end of its patience. The scale of Top Gear's commercial success no longer offset the cost of managing everything that came with Clarkson. He was suspended, and the BBC confirmed it would not be renewing his contract. A legal settlement followed for an amount widely reported to exceed £100,000, with the exact figure remaining undisclosed. Clarkson's statement read, "I would like to say sorry once again to Ocean Timon for the incident and its regrettable aftermath. I want to reiterate that none of this was in any way his fault. I would also like to make it clear that the abuse he has suffered since the incident is unwarranted, and I am sorry too that he has to go through that. I am pleased that this matter is now resolved. Ocean was always a creatively exciting part of Top Gear, and I wish him every success with his future projects." The abuse Clarkson referenced was the wave of social media attacks directed at Timon by fans who had apparently concluded, without evidence, that the producer must have been at fault. Clarkson was consistent in stating the opposite. The public response in support of Clarkson was immediate and enormous. A petition demanding his reinstatement gathered 1 million signatures. It was ignored. The BBC held its position, and Clarkson was out. There had been widespread speculation that the organization's plan was to keep James May and Richard Hammond and rebuild Top Gear around a new lead presenter. If that was the strategy, it failed immediately. Both May and Hammond resigned in solidarity and followed Clarkson out the door. James May later reflected on the collapse. "I thought it was very unfortunate, and I don't actually think our Top Gear had to end because of it. I think it could have been patched up and put down to a bit of high stress and flightiness. To be honest, it happened, it's regrettable, and it's unfortunate, but it didn't need to lead to the collapse of something very successful. Maybe these things are ordained, and it was time for us to move on. We'd been doing it by then for a decade, I think more, and I never imagined it would last as long. I went into it from magazine journalism, and I thought it would be a good laugh, probably for a couple of years." Richard Hammond said almost nothing publicly, citing concern that anything he said would be misread. He still chose to follow the others. Top Gear returned in 2016, with a new lineup featuring Chris Evans, Matt LeBlanc, Chris Harris, and Rory Reid, but failed to recapture anything close to its former audience. That version ran until 2019. Further attempts to revive it in 2019 and 2022 similarly fell short. Clarkson, May, and Hammond, meanwhile, moved to Amazon almost immediately, The Grand Tour launched and essentially resumed where Top Gear had left off, with Amazon granting a level of editorial latitude the BBC had long since stopped being comfortable providing. The humor was notably less extreme than Top Gear's most controversial episodes, either because the trio had genuinely recalibrated or because Amazon had made clear what it would and wouldn't accept. Controversy didn't disappear entirely. Various segments drew accusations of racism and homophobia, with one particular moment in Series 3, Episode 3 drawing criticism from singer Will Young, who objected to a joke suggesting the Jeep Wrangler had become popular among gay drivers. The Grand Tour ran from 2016 until September 2024, producing 46 episodes in total, before concluding, and the circumstances of its conclusion bring us to the biggest scandal of Clarkson's career, by reach and consequence. We've mentioned his various media columns in passing, but they deserve more careful attention here. Clarkson has written a column for The Sun since 1996, using it as a direct channel for his personal opinions across a remarkably wide range of subjects. Unlike what appeared on Top Gear, these columns are entirely his own. No writing team, no head writer, no executive producer. Full personal responsibility. In December 2022, he published a piece that set an entirely new benchmark for the volume of outrage a single article could generate. The target was Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, wife of Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, son of King Charles III, and the late Diana, Princess of Wales. The column was headlined, "One day, Harold the Glove Puppet will tell the truth about a woman talking bee." It depicted Meghan as manipulative and attention-hungry, portrayed her as using her husband as a puppet, and contained a passage in which Clarkson described fantasizing about crowds pelting her with excrement as she was marched through the streets of British towns while they chanted shame. The reference was to the infamous Walk of Shame scene from Game of Thrones. Clarkson framed it as satire. IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organization, received a record-breaking 25,000 complaints, prompting the article to be pulled within 24 hours of publication. IPSO chairman Lord Fawkes determined the imagery was humiliating and degrading toward the Duchess. Harry and Meghan publicly accused Clarkson of promoting misogyny and dangerous conspiracy theories. The Sun acknowledged that the column had fallen below its editorial standards, while simultaneously arguing it had not technically breached the editor's code. IPSO's formal findings were subsequently published in The Sun. Clarkson's own response on social media acknowledged that his reference to Game of Thrones had landed badly, expressed horror at the hurt caused, and promised greater care in future. The consequences extended well beyond the press coverage. Amazon announced that the Grand Tour would be ending and indicated it was unlikely to renew Clarkson's arrangements for Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or Clarkson's Farm. By this point, you likely have some kind of opinion about the man, and some kind of view about where humor ends and something else begins. What's equally worth acknowledging, however, is that Clarkson's story isn't only a catalog of controversy. There is another dimension to it, one that has surprised a great many people who had already written him off entirely. Clarkson's Farm, which launched on Amazon in 2021, caught virtually everyone off guard. The premise is simple. Clarkson decides to run his own farm and documents everything as it actually happens, without a script and without a safety net. The person who showed up for that production was, by almost universal agreement, not the same character people had been watching for 30 years. The bloated, deliberately provocative persona was gone. In its place was someone who appeared genuinely vulnerable, frequently out of his depth, and unexpectedly humble. Whether that's the real Clarkson or an image carefully constructed to rehabilitate public opinion is a question that comes up regularly. It's also entirely possible that without a script and without the architecture of a controversy-driven brand, he's simply freer to be an actual person. The show pairs Clarkson with Caleb Cooper, a young farmer who knew nothing about television and cared less. Cooper's role is entirely unscripted. He responds to Clarkson's agricultural cluelessness with the kind of straight-talking directness that only someone with no interest in performance can produce. The dynamic works. What elevated the show beyond entertainment, though, was what it revealed about the state of farming in Britain and beyond. The series exposes a sector under extraordinary strain, farmers operating on margins of under 1%, dealing with weather unpredictability, navigating poorly conceived regulations, and drowning in bureaucracy. The impact has been tangible. A 2025 storyline saw Clarkson forced to cull a pregnant cow at his diddly squat farm following a bovine tuberculosis outbreak that placed the entire property under lockdown until all infected cattle had been removed. The unborn calves had to die with the mother. Clarkson described the experience as emotionally devastating and was openly critical of the government's handling of the TB testing system, questioning why no vaccine had been developed and why calves couldn't be delivered before their mothers were put down. The show's effect on public engagement with agriculture has been significant in concrete ways. The diddly squat farm shop set up as part of the series prompted a measurable increase in traffic to similar farming outlets across the UK. University applications for agricultural programs have risen sharply, reversing a trend of declining interest that had been worrying the industry for years. In farming communities both domestically and internationally, the response has ranged from genuine appreciation to something approaching reverence, with figures in the industry describing the show's contribution to public awareness as genuinely transformative. Given all of that, Amazon's apparent change of direction following the Meghan Markle fallout makes more commercial sense than it might at first appear. Clarkson's farm has been confirmed for a 6th season, and Clarkson is returning to host Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. The show regularly attracts an average of 5 million views per episode, making it the single biggest Amazon production in the UK behind the Grand Tour, a program that has now ended. Letting go of that audience would be a costly decision. The debate over whether Clarkson's contributions to public life balance against the long record of offense he's caused is one that different people will resolve differently, and we're not going to resolve it here. Some will argue that Clarkson's farm represents who he actually is when he's not performing a character, and that the character was always exactly that, a performance built around a brand. Others will maintain that a farming show, however genuinely impactful, does not erase the cumulative damage of decades of stereotyping, physical violence, and inflammatory writing. Both views have evidence behind them. What's beyond dispute is that in farming communities at least, Jeremy Clarkson is considered something close to a hero, and whatever comes next, nobody who has followed his career closely would bet against him finding a way to make news again.